So about 2 years ago, there was apparently this big internet drama controversy over this breakdancing dad and his influencer daughter. And even though I think of myself as terminally online, I didn't learn about it until like a week ago, at which point I don't know either of these people to pass judgment on the situation, but I will say the father reminded me a lot of my father, or kind of like a cross between my father and my sort of mentor, Sean Fry. And he wrote a book. He wrote this book, which is basically a sort of self-help business book. And one thing that I think I need to talk about more is I don't try to find the best books. I try to find the most interesting books, the books that are going to make me think about things in a way that I haven't. And so the thing about this guy is he made a fortune twice, and then he wrote a book on how to do it. And I'm like, okay, this sounds compelling enough that I'm interested in reading it, especially because I feel some affinity. He reminds me somewhat of my father, somewhat of Sean. And I read it, and I've been thinking about it, and I will say I had sort of three big reactions when I started reading it. The first one is I quickly learned that both of his fortunes he made in junk mail, and I'll get to that because I think it's easier to make your fortune in areas like that, but it's also, you have to be willing to be annoying and do things that you might or might not consider morally questionable. And then reading it, I had the impression, okay, he obviously comes from the Ivy League, like elite class, and I'm pretty sure he had a lot of nepotistic advantages, which he did, but that doesn't necessarily, and it doesn't obviate the advice he gives, because he gives a lot of advice that I think is actually generally good, even if you don't have those advantages. And he confirmed it sort of indirectly in a later chapter. And the other thing is, reading this, I was like, I'm getting the strong impression that this guy is neurodivergent. I mean, reminding me of my father and Sean also probably pushed me in that direction. Plus, he, big fan of Elon Musk, which Sean is also, which I do not have as high an opinion of Elon Musk. But I'm like, okay, I'm going to read this book. And so one of the things I noticed about reading it is he made his fortune as an ad writer for direct marketing, so junk mail campaigns, which he calls it junk mail. And the writing, the style in this book very much kind of reads like junk mail, which on one hand makes it easy to read. On the other hand, it also makes it kind of tedious to pick up again and easy to potentially miss stuff. So I got through it pretty quickly, but I'm going to reread it at some point. It's also, a lot of self-help business books are organized around a central theme. This is just him info dumping everything that he thought was useful to his success in ways that he's sort of roughly categorized in a few categories. And I want to think about how this advice relates to other stuff I've read and other stuff I've done. But wanted to talk about these three things, because obviously being neurodivergent, a book like this is going to appeal to me more. He mentioned he was diagnosed with both Asperger's and ADHD, and I'm like, yep. The only thing that surprised me about that is that at his age, he was diagnosed. And then there was, again, I was under the impression, I'm like, this, the way he's talked about things, I'm pretty sure he comes from the Ivy League level class. And so it turns out his father was a Dartmouth College professor and editor of the National Review, which was a prominent conservative magazine run by William Buckley. And so he had these connections. He got into Dartmouth. He said that he was told his academic scores were the lowest for Dartmouth that year, but he got in on the fact that his father was a professor, he had multiple relatives who were alumnus, and he was really good at two different sports, skiing, and I forget what the other one was. And that is how people, at least white people, get into Amherst. If you're Asian or Hispanic, it's a little bit different. This is not a video for advice on how to get into schools like that, but if you're white, to get into Amherst, you basically need to be a legacy admission and a good athlete, and those are basically the two requirements from everything I could tell from meeting Amherst students for getting into Amherst. And so I'm like, he was going to Dartmouth earlier when it was easier to get into Dartmouth relatively, but it still was a legacy admission. However, even though he is someone who believes that ultimately like his success comes from what he did, the way he writes it doesn't come across as arrogant to me. He has modesty about the mistakes he's made and about how some of the stuff, a lot of his stuff depends on luck, but it is making your own luck, spotting the right opportunities. And so I'm realizing reading this, and I think this is the case with most self-help stuff, is that the advice he gives falls into three categories for me, which is the stuff that I already sort of know and agree with, the stuff that I kind of disagree with, and the stuff that I'm not even getting what he's saying enough to have an opinion. I think that's just generally going to be reading stuff how it is. But in terms of self-help, I'm reading this and I'm like, oh, I go back and I read something like, I didn't quite get this. So I'm going to reread this whole book at some point, and I'm going to think about how it connects to these other books. I do want to say, because he's a professional copywriter, he actually laid the book out very well, and it is decent quality print on demand. And this one was actually, normally they're printed the day of, but this one was actually printed in Orlando, got returned. And so I read this book, and there were a few things that I was thinking about based on that. One of them is, again, the fact that he made his money doing junk mail. And junk mail, obviously, he doesn't think it's immoral. And I wouldn't say it's immoral, but it is. It requires you to be annoying to a lot of people in order to get results from a few people who, especially given that a lot of his work was for political causes, is often that kind of junk mail. You're sort of guilting people into giving money as opposed to selling them stuff that they really want. And so that is not the kind of thing that I want to do, but I'm thinking about, if I wanted to do AI slop, which I could do, I could probably make a lot of money doing it. And there would be people consuming it, but I don't think necessarily means there's demand for it. And I actually wrote an article on it comparing AI slop to private equity, because private equity is supposedly the market's working. And I'm like, it's the capital markets working under certain circumstances, but it makes the world clearly a worse place generally, private equity. And I think it's the same thing with AI slop. And so not only do I not want to do AI slop, but because I fundamentally feel like it would be making the world a worse place, I would not be motivated to do it. And I think one thing that helped him is because he was raising money for Republican candidates and believed it made a difference, he was motivated to think, I'm doing good. And I don't have that advantage for me with making AI slop content. But that is the case. If you are willing to do things that other people don't want to do, you can make more money. I mean, I was having a hard time finding a job in Austin, and then I got a job at an oil company that paid much better than Austin would have paid, lower cost of living city, because people don't want to work at oil companies. Oil and gas, most people from my background at least find questionable morally to work for. And then it's also not cool the way it is working at a tech company. So I ended up making more money in a lower cost of living city. The important thing is I could actually get hired because they had a neurodiversity hiring program, which I'm going to talk about that in May. I have a number of videos planned for Autism Awareness Month. This one I'm doing before. I just wanted to introduce this book. And there are a couple of other things in here that I was thinking about. And so one thing is I made a Discord that I still have not posted the link to because I don't want to deal with moderating my Discord server, even though in principle I like the idea of just anyone who's interested enough in the channel could join the Discord server. I also made a Ko-Fi, and I'm not doing Patreon for now. I wrote a post about that too that I'll also link below. And I've set criteria for when I think I would. Basically, Patreon kind of did a bait and switch on me, and I'm resenting them for that. And even though I would almost certainly be better off because more people are willing to donate to Patreon, I'm like, I'm not trying to be a professional YouTuber. And so for me, I feel like I have incentives to not do Patreon and just have Ko-Fi, even if it's going to result in fewer donations. But one thing I'm thinking about is, well, I don't really have, and I know doing perks for members, even a few, get a lot more donations, more engagement. I, at the moment, don't want to prioritize that because I'm trying to prioritize actually building a company. But one thing I could do is I could make the Ko-Fi, they have it set up so you donate to the Ko-Fi and you get access to the Discord. And that is also an incentive to not misbehave because then you lose your donation. And I'll have to think about, do I want to keep it just token cheap or do I want to have it a little bit more of incentive to behave? How much of a moderation issue would that be? So we'll see. I may have a Discord, in which case it'll be on the Ko-Fi, and it may not. And I'll note in the description, have I actually set that up by the time this video comes out. But there are a couple of other things in this book that I am now blanking on, but I was questioning it, and then I'm like, this actually, I think, is... I don't like it, but I think it is... Oh, another interesting thing in this book is, so as I mentioned, he was not a skilled student, and that, in that sense, he was kind of the opposite of me, even though I relate to a lot of what he was going through. Like, he talked about, he took his driver's license exam, or the learner's permit test, he calls it the driver's license exam, and completely failed it the first time after reading the book once through. When I was 16 and a half, I read the driver's ed book, whatever it's called, through once, went to the DMV, or RMV in Massachusetts it's called, only state that calls it the registry instead of the Department of Motor Vehicles, and got a perfect score. And then I did not get my license at 16 for a reason I might make another video about. I did get my license at 20, had to redo my permit, and even though I hadn't read the book at all, I still passed by one or two questions. Either it was, I forget if it was one or two wrong. And so a lot of his advice on how to learn stuff, I'm like, I haven't done a lot of the stuff you're saying, and that has worked well for me. And I don't know, are there ways I could apply it that it could work better? And is it good advice for other people? Because there's a whole section on how to learn and remember stuff better. And as I've talked about, like, I think there's 3 reasons that I remember stuff well, which are synesthesia. And he mentions, like, seeing stuff helps you remember. And so synesthesia, actually visualizing these things, probably helps. Having a lot of stuff be emotionally salient to me, and then knowing a lot of frameworks and knowing how stuff fits into them. But yeah, so I don't have specific thoughts, like, in general. There was one other, oh yeah, and then so as I mentioned, like, one of my goals, my New Year's resolution, was to try to get better at networking. And he has some advice here that I'm going to try, and I'll see how it goes. It's the kind of thing that would definitely work if I was like an Amherst alumnus. I don't know how much it'll work for a random person, but I'm going to try some of this, and I'll get back on how did I feel about this? Does this seem useful in terms of what I'm trying to do or not? And one thing that I really started thinking about is you'll see a lot of debate on whether it's better to be a generalist or a specialist. I'm going to make a video on that at some point. And I think the answer, and he articulates it well, is that it's better to start as a generalist and then find things to specialize in and get good at, which is what I am trying to do. So anyways, wanted to talk about this book quickly because I find it interesting. It is not like a standard self-help business book, and that is both a benefit and a drawback. You can't read it like you can standard self-help books. There's no real underlying connecting theme. Like, a professional self-help writer would probably get like at least 3 books out of this, if not more, whereas he's just everything, and he's trying to keep things as short as possible in each explanation, which I agree with. And he writes it like a copywriter, like and self-help books are usually easy to read, but in a certain way that doesn't quite feel like you're being sold to. This book feels a little bit, to me, like I'm being sold to, which is a little bit off-putting, which I think is why I didn't want to pick it up. But once you're in it, because he writes clearly, it's easy to get through, and I think that's kind of a drawback, is when it's harder to read, it's easier to remember stuff. You have to think about what it means. So I'm going to reread it. And I want to talk about this quickly, because I think it's interesting, and I will probably bring it up more as I reread parts of it or think about how stuff he said connects with other books I've read and my own experience. And again, I don't have, on the original controversy, I feel empathetic towards both of them. The daughter reminds me of my brother and of some of my cousins, and as I said, he reminds me of my father and Sean Fry. But I learned about this book, that he made a fortune twice, and I'm like, I should look into it. And I would have thought, if I'd known before, oh, he was a Dartmouth alum who got in because of legacy admissions, I would have not taken it seriously. And I'm glad I did, because I feel like the advice actually takes into account people starting from different places, and it can still, most of it still applies even if you don't have those connections, which is really unusual for people from that social class giving advice. So thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, this is Leela, and I'll see y'all on the next one.